people loved the classical world. They loved Roman antiquity. We joke now about people thinking about the Roman Empire all the time, but they really, really did in the 18th century, especially with Britain kind of expanding its empire and imperialism. They really looked to ancient Rome. And they thought the best way to learn about that was to go to places like that.
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. In the 18th century, intrepid British travellers set off to continental Europe in search of art, architecture, and a good time. But what were the must-see locations on the Grand Tour? How did people overcome the challenges of language, currency, and very uncomfortable mules? And what were fashionable Europe's biggest scandals? Well, for our latest Everything You Wanted to Know episode, I'm joined by the historian Lizzie Rogers for a whistle-stop journey through the history of the Grand Tour. Thanks for joining me, Lizzie. On today's Everything You Wanted to Know episode, we're going to be taking a whistle-stop tour across the continent because we're talking about the Grand Tour. So before we delve into the subject and go and see some of the sights and sounds of the Grand Tour, what exactly was it? What are we talking about when we say the Grand Tour?
It's a good question to start with, because I think we use the phrase the Grand Tour a lot. And really what it is, it's this phenomenon in mainly the 18th century with its origins in the 17th, where people, normally young men, but it's quite a restrictive definition to say that, go with a tutor or somebody they would call a cicerone or a guide to continental Europe, normally to France or Switzerland and Italy, to spend some time travelling around, learning, communicating with the ancients, so to speak, and expanding their education. It's normally in that gap between finishing their young life and they're kind of on the cusp of adulthood and responsibility as well.
It sounds a bit like a modern gap year. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly what it is. It's a good way to put it.
You said that it's got its origins in the 17th century. How exactly did it become popular? When did it become the done thing?
So yeah, it begins in the 17th century. There's a Catholic priest called Richard Lascelles who uses the phrase in a 1670 book, a travel book about the continent, the Grand Tour. And it's this idea that people are fully completing their education, and it becomes more and more popular into the 18th century because there's this idea that people loved the classical world. They loved Roman antiquity. We joke now about people thinking about the Roman Empire all the time, but really they really, really did in the 18th century, especially with Britain kind of expanding its empire and imperialism. They really looked to ancient Rome. And they thought the best way to learn about that was to go to places like that. I mean, Rome was being uncovered, other places in Italy, all the archaeology was going on. So it becomes more and more popular. And of course, as more and more people do it, more people write travel literature. They publish their letters from these places. So more and more people have a hankering to go. And it kind of widens the group of people that go, and it becomes the done thing if you have the money to go to continental Europe and explore it for yourself. I think that kind of idea of seeing for oneself is a really important part of it too. So you can sit at home and you can read travel literature, but you're not truly educated if you haven't been and kind of seen it with your own eyes. And that's bound up with ideas of the Enlightenment and kind of learning and curiosity and this idea of kind of gentleman's leisure and pleasure, but for women too as well.
Well, I was going to ask you, you said it widened the pool of people that could go, but we're not talking about everybody in society here, are we? Who are we talking about going on the Grand Tour?
So if we take it as kind of a narrower definition as possible, it really was intended for young men to go, kind of around the age of 18. They'd spend a couple of years going. But women went as well. I mean, it really is kind of reserved for these richer members of society who have the money to go, although ironically it could be cheaper to live in the continent than it was to live in England. But you had newlyweds going, you had young women going with their families, you had older women with lots of money going by themselves or traveling with friends. And also in the second half of the 18th century, the roads get easier to navigate. There's more inns, there's more infrastructure, which means it does become slightly cheaper. So you have other people going too. And there are also people going for work and kind of touring across Europe. So you get merchants, you get historians, diplomats and things like that. And also if you were, I guess, a servant, you could be lucky enough to go with your employer too, rather than them employ people on the continent. So that was another way you could get to go to.
And what about celebrities? Do we know any famous names
Yes.
who went on the Grand Tour?
There were many. Lord Byron was one. Lord Byron spent a lot of time on the Grand Tour. He loved Greece. He ends up loving Greece so much when he travels. He ends up passing away in Greece in 1824, kind of joining a freedom fight there, which is kind of wild to think about. You have the Duchess of Northumberland goes, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Lots of these kind of who's who of aristocratic men and women go. There's one called Lady Hester Stanhope who goes. She goes into the Middle East. If you go and visit lots of country houses, you'll find that if you're a National Trust member or something like that, you'll walk around these houses, see these names, see art and architecture that comes from the Grand Tour, and find that most people who own these houses will have spent some time on the continent or corresponding with people who did. So actually, when you delve into it a little bit, there's so many people who spend time living in Europe and even pushing into the Middle East and Northern Africa as well.
Well, that leads me on nicely to a question we've had in from one of our listeners on Instagram, Julie Brimmel. And Julie has asked, what were the most popular destinations? Essentially, was there a set route?
So a little bit. The main route that people would take would be France or Switzerland, mainly to improve your French language skills, and then it'd be followed by Italy. And the place to go in Italy was Rome. If you didn't go to those places, it was seen that you hadn't done it properly. But this kind of expands. I mentioned Lord Byron goes to Greece. People expand and go to places like Belgium, Germany, Austria. It depends what people's interests were. The Netherlands could also be popular if you like Dutch art. Elizabeth Percy, the first Duchess of Northumberland, spent time there buying art and things like that. So it really did depend on personal interest, but the places to go were France or Switzerland and Italy. And then in Italy, it depended what cities you wanted, but Rome, Venice and Florence, a little bit like I think we talk about today, were kind of the cultural centres that you had to tick off to say that you properly done it.
Within these cities and these countries that people wanted to visit, were there specific must-see sites as well?
There were. I mean, when you read kind of people's diaries of going, they really wanted to go see museums and collections and historic sites. So there's a lot of diary entries that tell you about going to see these princely collections. Some of my favourites I've read about is the Elizabeth Percy, the Duchess of Northumberland's diary. She talks about going to the Louvre in Paris. That was very, very popular. She talks about going to see all these private collectors around Germany as well, and going to these princely palaces to see what they're like and see the objects that they've got. When the Countess of Pomfret went on her grand tour, she writes this lovely passage about going to Austria and going to Innsbruck Castle, which had a really famous kind of cabinet of curiosity museum there. And she spent all this time there and said about how kind of intelligent and wonderful she thought the people of Austria were because of this thing that she'd seen. And then, of course, getting into Italy, places like the Colosseum, the Forum in Rome, they were really, really essential. There's archaeological excavations happening all around people. The Countess of Pomfret writes this really great piece where she talks about going to the Colosseum and imagining kind of animals being in there and gladiators and things like that, which I think is really, really cool, because I think we still think about that today when we go. And then, of course, as you go into kind of Venice and Florence, it's seeing all these art collections like the Majesty of the Renaissance as well, kind of connecting with Medici history in Florence and Michelangelo and things like that. There was very much, I mean, I'm probably terrible for this, but there's always a list of museums and art pieces I wanted to see, and they very much travelled like that too. That was really what their ideas were governed by.
Max Quigley has asked whether locations went in and out of style.
Yes, I mean, particularly with people writing travel literature a lot, this kind of explodes as a genre during the 18th century. So they'll write about different places, and then those reading it will want to go visit those places. It expands, and then also places become fashionable because of who's there. So there's a gentleman called Sir William Hamilton. He was a British ambassador to Naples. And he made Naples really fashionable towards the end of the 18th century because he threw these huge glamorous parties at his house in the city, which pushed more and more British aristocrats to visit there, to stop in and be part of this kind of travelling bit of British society moving around. And you find things like that happening. You also find that with new discoveries, art and archaeology and things like that, people are kind of rushing to see these things for their own eyes as well. Greece becomes a big hotspot because of this. Also becomes more popular as the Napoleonic Wars begin to take hold, because it becomes more difficult to get into France and Italy. But you can skirt round and go to Greece, so still have that travelling experience, but avoid war in a way that you couldn't if you set foot in France.
Well, this is something that Julie Rowan has asked us on X. She explicitly asked, did people still go on the Grand Tour during the Napoleonic Wars?
Yes, yeah. So they did still go on the Grand Tour, but their schedule was very much amended according to where was safe to go, effectively. So as I mentioned, Greece becomes a lot more popular. You get people pushing into the Middle East. So Lord Byron goes on the Grand Tour 1809 to 1811. He spends these first kind of 2 years traveling around Europe. It's slap bang in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. So he heads down to Greece and ends up falling in love with it there, and then ends up spending the rest of his life kind of traveling to and from and thinking about Greece. So people do this instead. They skirt around these more dangerous destinations, but also it becomes more popular to take a tour of the UK, so to speak. So to go up to Scotland, to go to the Lake District. We see that in Pride and Prejudice. We get Elizabeth Bennet going with her aunt and Uncle Gardner. They're supposed to go to the Lake District. They end up cutting it short and going to Derbyshire instead. So you get more and more people publishing tours of the UK as well, because it's a lot more accessible. It's cheaper to go, and you're not as threatened as much by war. So people start to see their own country, publish more views of the country that they lived in, and taking to that instead of the continent.
And for anyone who was feeling a bit more adventurous than Scotland or France or Italy, Traska on Instagram has asked whether anybody ever went to Eastern Europe. Was that part of this when we're talking about the continent?
Yes, it was. It was definitely a rarer destination for people to head to, but there definitely was evidence of people going. So one of my favourite women in history, just because her life is so dramatic and interesting, Lady Elizabeth Holland, she ends up marrying a much older man and convincing him to go to the continent with her. And she ends up going to Budapest, actually following somebody that she's in love with, going to Hungary and following some of her friends in the early 1790s. Yeah, so there's definitely evidence of people going into Eastern Europe. And of course, with Britain expanding its view across the globe, they're expanding where they're sending diplomats to and things like that. So you also get them kind of having a more diplomatic political presence in these countries too, sending them out to Scandinavia, sending them to Eastern Europe, sending them to Turkey and places like that. So there are these kind of tracks of travel that happen, and people follow them if they're so interested. But yeah, there's definitely evidence, even though it's a more rare decision, but people going to Eastern Europe.
Well, something I'm really intrigued by, and there might be a different answer for every single country that we're talking about here, but I mean, how different were these continental locations to Britain at this time? Would there have been a big element of culture shock?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, especially for us now in the 21st century, if we want to learn about somewhere, we can Google it. We can look on Google Earth. We can literally walk streets. We can even sometimes go inside museums, all this wonderful technology that particularly expanded during COVID and enabled us to travel from home. It's a very different feeling being stood in somewhere to seeing it on your computer, but we are a lot more prepared for the things that are out in the world than they would have been during the 18th century. So many of these things would have been a culture shock to them, but people definitely played on this lack of knowledge, especially to sell travel literature and things like this. So Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, she married Edward Wortley Montagu, who was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. So she spends a lot of time in what's now Turkey. And she writes letters back. These letters are published. They're so interesting. And she writes in them, literally, she won't lie like other travelers, because they've been led to believe that, these people are wildly different. They're kind of, and of course there's this kind of English centric view to it, where they think the English are better than everyone else. So, all these ways of life are kind of more savage. They're not as good. And she literally writes that she respects the Turkish women so much. She's been so welcomed into their culture, and all these people have lied about it. And, she might sell more literature if she lies and makes it sound all fantastical. But actually, these people have very similar manners and ways of life. It's just respecting the different cultures, which is actually a very forward-thinking way of looking at it. But other people wrote this as well, and said that, people were polite, the cultures were fascinating in all different places. So there is an element that everything is, of course, different, and you can engage with it and learn about it. But there was almost this idea of shocking people with kind of these tales of how different things are, that when people turned up, they were like, actually, no, it's not like that. It's just done to sell books and papers and things like that.
That gives a fairly positive impression in terms of the reception that people got. And one of the questions we've had on Instagram from one of our listeners, Clara Rose, is really intriguing. And they ask, did Grand Tour tourism have similar negative effects on countries that were visited as tourism does today? Is there any way we can tell that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, particularly because, and the first thing that springs to my mind is, so during this era, it's an era of kind of exploration of colonialism. And although we think of that as being much further afield than continental Europe, there is this element of kind of British people, kind of British aristocrats going over to the continent and just buying everything up, digging everything up. I mean, the Lord Elgin goes and takes the Parthenon frieze, and that's kind of its whole huge debate at this time. And going in and kind of buying up all these things, whether they're copies, whether they're real. There's a story about Lady Hester Stanhope, she's super interesting. She was a political hostess for her uncle, who was William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister. And when he dies, she gets this parliamentary pension. So she uses it to go travel to into Europe and further afield, eventually with her lover, Michael Bruce. And they end up in the Middle East. And she says that she's going to kind of go dig things up just for the pure interest of what's going to happen. And they find this statue that they believe is it's 7 foot tall. They think it's possibly of a Roman emperor. And she says something along the lines of, I'm going to have it broken up so they don't think I'm just going to loot it and take it back home. Now, I'm putting some anachronistic language on that. But to me, that's even more destructive than trying to take it, breaking it up to prove that she's not going to take it. So there's this kind of idea of taking things, of buying things up. But of course, that isn't to say a lot of people who lived in these places, that were from these places, didn't get the ability to cash in on tourists coming, like producing copies, running inns, like being tour guides, all these things as well. So there's a dual side to it, but that's what always immediately springs to mind when thinking about kind of the negative effects of visiting these places.
Yeah, there's an interesting duality at play there, isn't there? A bit like today. Well, I wonder then, when you mention tour guides and inns, let's get down to some nitty-gritty practicalities. So if me and you were heading out on the Grand Tour, how exactly do we go about that? How do we travel around to begin with?
It's well, it wouldn't be as comfortable as it is today. The big problem actually was crossing the Alps if they wanted to go further south. That was a logistical problem that could be very expensive. You could end up sat on a mule trying to do it. Hester Piozzi, who formerly Thrale, her and her husband were kind of exiled by society to the continent, and they end up going into Italy. And because she has a little bit more money, she can pay to be sat in what is effectively a sedan chair. They call it a chaise porter, where they have men kind of carrying it over their shoulders, and she sat in it, and she goes over the Alps like this. That's the huge issue. But of course, as well, there's no hotels.com. You can't book ahead. You've got to kind of find inns along the way, and there will be maps and there will be guides at these things and kind of recommendations and guidebooks. But of course, there's other logistical things, like a lot of these people are very aristocratic. They need servants to help them. So they would pick up servants as they went along, besides taking their own retinue of people. They would have to deal with different weathers. Of course, crossing the Alps again gets very cold. So they would have to travel with furs to wear to go over the Alps. And then they're descending into these really hot climates that they're not so much used to. So they wouldn't exactly have traveled light in the way that we could pack everything into a suitcase today. There were a lot of things to consider and a lot of people actually involved. Even if we talk about kind of these intrepid travelers who went by themselves, there would have been a lot of people helping them, trying to organize putting that trip together and helping them along the route.
I'm really intrigued by this idea of guidebooks you mentioned there. What kind of information might they have had in them? Would they have been like the guidebooks we have today that, you know, say this place 3 stars, it's got decent facilities?
It very much would be, these are the places you've got to see when you go to these places. Like you go to Rome, they would have listed the Colosseum, the Forum, places like that. It would have often had reflections about different things that you could see, places you will go when you were there. Guidebooks are really fascinating. This is an era as well when we kind of country house guidebooks in the UK become into play. You know, people are writing up their tours, they're publishing their letters. So there was a lot of information out there, and very much like us today, if you're sifting through TripAdvisor reviews, like sifting through the kind of good information from the bad information and assimilating it to what you want. But they when you look in libraries of these kind of country houses of people who would have gone on the Grand Tour and would have travelled, you can normally always find travel literature and the kind of the equivalent of guidebooks that they would have used either to read from home and learn about these places or use to actually travel and plan their trips and see what they wanted to see.
So we've got uncomfortable journeys on mules.
Yes.
But what are some of the other mundane challenges of travelling at this time?
So one of them would have very much been currency. That would have been an issue. And of course, the European map doesn't look like it does today. Italy especially was still separated into kingdoms, and those different kingdoms had different currencies. The values could change week by week. That would have been an issue. Traveling through checkpoints as well. So I think we sometimes look back at this period and we think, oh, it must have been really easy to cross borders and kind of get away, but you needed a passport. Passports have a lot longer a history than we think. They think kind of the earliest versions of passports issued to English people were during the reign of Henry V. Honestly, I was surprised when I looked this up, how far back, and actually there have been records kept of every passport ever issued since the late 18th century. So people had to get a passport to go, and those would be checked at checkpoints across Europe. And particularly after the Napoleonic Wars, and while those were going on, at checkpoints, kind of all the things that people were carrying with them would be checked. Customs was still an issue, trying to take things through. We think of these as very much modern issues that we have to deal with if we want to buy lots of souvenirs and bring them back and ship them back. But they were all things that they were having to contend with a lot in the 18th century too, but without kind of planes and airports and modern systems of having to deal with them.
Yeah, and what about language? There was no, Google Translate back then.
Yes. So typically a lot of the aristocrats who would have travelled to the continent would have had languages included in their education as they were growing up, particularly women. Language, it's seen as being very accomplished if you could speak several languages. But of course, then there are dialects and different ways of speaking languages. And part of the reason why they were going as well was to improve it. That's why you go to France or Switzerland, is to improve your French. Because as we all know, you can learn a language, but if you're not immersed in it, you can't pick it up in the same way. But that's part of the reason why they would have tour guides, they would have tutors. And I mentioned kind of a type of tour guide called a cicerone. So they would be like a local tour guide. I think the name of it comes from Cicero, the kind of Roman senator and teacher. This idea of like teaching people, kind of being a translator, helping them out, taking them to the best places. That would have been a real help when dealing with people, because of course you go to some of these more remote places that these paths haven't been forged for a long time like we do now, and finding people who spoke English would have been an issue. So those who weren't so adept at languages would have struggled and really had to rely on those local people helping them out, all those tour guides.
Was safety generally seen as being a concern, or was there a sense that these were pretty well-trodden paths and you'd be fine?
So there was a sense that they were quite well trodden at this point, but safety was always a concern, especially for those travellers who were seen as more intrepid, more curious, and who were going to newer places that not so many people had gone before. But for a lot of the people who were going there, I think that was part of the charm, that they saw it as something really new, really exciting. And it was a little bit dangerous, but that danger was kind of a romantic danger.
I mean, as you said at the start, it sounds very much like the gap years of today.
Yes.
Just another question on practicalities from Ali Vitale Newman on X. How was it funded? I'm guessing most people were just using their own personal wealth, but did they have to carry money around with them in their retinue?
Yes, so they would have to carry money, but there's quite a lot of examples, especially of young men going to the continent. They go for a couple of years, writing back to ask for more money, or having money sent to them, having too much fun and spending all their money. A lot of the people were funded by family money. I mentioned Lady Hester Stanhope ended up with a parliamentary pension to kind of push her through all her travels, and then she ended up relying on her lover's money as well, which helped them. And so, yeah, writing home to ask for more money became a thing, kind of passing those things through. And of course, then that has its own litany of problems trying to get that money safely back through, or running out of money in the middle of nowhere. And that did happen. People sometimes did run out of money, and that could cause issues, and have them in slightly shady problems. But yeah, there's kind of money being crossed around, items of value as well, kind of pushing them through all these expensive tours. And of course, like today, you can there's different levels of being able to pay for these things. You could go for the top best way of staying and way of traveling, or you could save a little bit of money and go for a cheaper option. And quite a lot of aristocrats who were running out of money, who were kind of cash poor, asset rich, would actually end up going to the continent for a few years because they found it a lot less expensive to rent a house in somewhere like Italy or France, rather than trying to deal with their own expenses in England.
Your point about people living on the continent instead of living in England because they could get a cheaper lifestyle is interesting. And you mentioned earlier about one of the grand tourists that you've looked at essentially having been exiled from England. There's a few figures who, are slightly disgraced and leave and go to the continent. Lord Byron being one, Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley being others. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that aspect of it, this idea that there were loads of people who've been disgraced in England just knocking around the continent.
Yeah, no, honestly, that was what it was like. The purposes of people traveling extended to so many different reasons. I mean, carrying on affairs, being able to live with a lover without kind of the scrutiny of British society, even though most of them knew. Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, she went to the continent to have an illegitimate child. There's a lot of kind of that happening, this idea that society's freer or there's less scrutiny. There's also kind of sadder aspects to it. There's a gentleman called William John Banks of Kingston Lacy House. So he went on the Grand Tour. He ended up traveling with Giovanni Belzoni, who was an kind of Italian strongman who he rediscovered, I should say, not found, the tomb of Seti I, which is now in the Sir John Soane Museum in London. William John Banks had this he loved travel. He brought back all these wonderful things to Kingston Lacy. He was designing it like an Italian palazzo. But he unfortunately ended up being exiled to the continent because of charges of homosexuality. So he ends up exiled to Venice, living there for the rest of his life, but writing back to Kingston Lacy and kind of controlling what the house looked like, saying how he wanted his collection displayed, and things like that. So he maintains this collection to England, but he just can't come back. And so there are lots of these kinds of stories that Europe almost became a refuge to people who kind of found themselves in these kind of unaccepting situations, or kind of difficult marriages and kind of trying to get away from them and things like that. It's very interesting when you kind of scratch the surface and look at some of these stories.
And do you think it's a refuge because, as you say, continental societies were perhaps a bit less strict in their moral codes, or is it because there was a sense of anonymity that people didn't have in England?
I think probably the anonymity. Societies across Europe definitely still had their kind of hierarchies. There were lots of princes, dukes, things like that. But but I think there was a certain level of anonymity that they could find, but I mean, you had kind of almost these travelling bands of English society were going across the continent. But it's almost like kind of the weather, the different buildings, the different places meant that it wasn't as strict as back home for them anyway. And it gave them a level of anonymity. They could change names. They could have this pretense that they were different people and kind of settle without everybody looking at them in the same way. And of course, I mean, we know even today the British press is pretty ruthless. And the media, and it was during the 18th and early 19th century, and it was a way to kind of get away from gossip and kind of create a new place of refuge for them too.
For those who weren't so much living on the continent but kind of passing through place by place, What do we know about their day-to-day activities? How much sightseeing was it, for example, compared to sitting at the gambling tables or other debauchery?
Yes. Yeah, it's so interesting sometimes when you read these accounts of grand tourists, and also, in fact, more interesting when you read accounts of what people thought of typical grand tourists. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, this has always stayed with me when I read it. She called the typical grand tourist, so a young man at the end of his formal education, 18, 19, kind of let loose on the continent with a tutor without his parents directly watching him. She called them the greatest blockheads in nature. That's just always stayed with me because I just think it's so funny. And she kind of says they don't do anything to improve the view of English people. They are kind of let loose, kind of having a great time on the continent. But an important part of it really was this idea of exploring, getting the art, architecture, kind of understanding the ancient world. And so you would find people going to lectures, they go to the theatre, going and kind of meeting all these interesting people as well across the continent. The Duchess of Northumberland, Elizabeth Percy, went to meet the philosopher Voltaire at his home. Burton Constable Hall near Hull, there was a brother and sister who lived there, William and Winifred, and they went to the continent ostensibly for William's health, but they ended up meeting Rousseau, the philosopher. So there's lots of interesting things like that. So it's a bit of a combination of both. And when you kind of read some of the literature, I think there's an Alexander Pope poem where he talks about kind of this duality of, by day they're going to the theatre, they're going to exhibitions, then by night they're kind of, playing around with women at the gambling tables, things like that. I would say for some people it was a more even balance than others, but others definitely love the kind of looser lifestyle and this kind of sense of freedom, especially if they'd spent years kind of in strict schooling, if they were an oldest son, being groomed to take over an estate or a job. It's the first taste of freedom, really. So I can sort of understand it, but also it's very interesting seeing the balance of what they actually did.
To linger a little bit longer at the gambling tables and the drinking saloons, Tracy Steele on X has asked, what were some of the Grand Tour's biggest scandals?
Oh, there's so many good ones. So I have a favourite. There's a lot of really interesting scandals, but to go back to Lady Elizabeth Holland, who I mentioned earlier, I said that in the early 1790s, she went with her much, much older husband. He was over 20 years older than her. She was originally Lady Webster, so her husband, Sir Geoffrey Webster, took her to Europe. They had some children. And of course, she's young, she's very vivacious, she's beautiful, and she attracts a lot of male attention. She also attracts female attention. She makes all these really great society friends who are also kind of married to older men and kind of, having affairs and things like that. And she ends up having an illegitimate daughter called Harriet Frances with Thomas Pelham, who's actually one of her husband's political advisors. And she ends up faking Harriet's death. To try and keep her from Webster. So it's a little bit of a tangled story. So she gives birth to Harriet in Florence, but the timeline means that her husband's not suspicious. I mean, he may well have known, but it could have been his daughter. But then she meets somebody else. She meets Henry Fox, who was 3rd Baron Holland, and he's the nephew of Charles James Fox, Earl Grey. And she falls completely in love with him. Now, she ends up getting pregnant by him, and there is no way in question that it could be her husband's child because her husband is left. So she's in fear. She knows she has to go back to England. She knows as soon as she goes back, her husband will initiate divorce proceedings from her. And she really does not want to let go of her daughter, Harriet. So what she decided to do was to fake Harriet's death. So she was still on the continent. Her husband was back in England. She was there with her two elder sons, Webster's children, and they were traveling to Medina. She sent the sons ahead, kept Harriet back, and said that she had measles, which was something that people would have really worried about back then in terms of an illness. Harriet was completely fine, and what she ended up doing was taking a trusted maid, asking her to take Harriet to Hamburg, where she went dressed in boys' clothes. And Lady Holland instead filled her violin case with rocks and pillows, sent it to the British consul as a coffin that supposedly had Harriet's body in it, and said that her daughter had died. Now, she got away with this for a little while. She went back to England in 1796. Her husband found out she was pregnant, that it wasn't his. They began divorce proceedings. She ends up having to give him most of her income, and she had a lot of family income. Her family had Jamaican slave plantations. And she gets this small allowance per annum. And then Lord Holland ends up having to pay damages to Webster too. They divorce, she has their baby. And 2 days after the divorce, they end up getting married. And they also lived together throughout this whole thing. So they really didn't care what society said to them. But then in 1799, it comes out that Harriet's actually alive and well. And Webster fights her for custody and wins Harriet's custody. And actually, there's quite a tragic end to this in terms of for Webster. So he ends up actually in 1800, so just a year after this, he ends up committing suicide because he racks up huge gambling debts post-divorce and kind of the toll that the custody battle and everything took on him. But Harriet goes to live with her mother, who is now Lady Holland, and she lives a very happy life with Lord Holland, and they run this kind of high society salon. She ends up recovering from the scandal quite well, considering that a lot of stuff happened in continental Europe. A lot of it came back home. But I think it's kind of one of my most interesting kind of favourite scandals of this period that plays out both in continental Europe and back in England as well.
So what happened in Europe didn't always stay in Europe then. I don't know how you're going to top that, Lizzie, but I was going to ask you whether you had any other favourite anecdotes that people recounted about their experiences of travel and how exciting that must have been at this time.
No, nothing as dramatic as that. But one of my favourite accounts of travel is in the late 1730s. Henrietta Fermor, who was the Countess of Pomfret, she and her husband take their two oldest daughters. They go travelling across Europe. And actually that was to save money. It was cheaper for them to live in Europe. And she writes all these letters back to her very close friend, Frances Seymour, who was Countess of Hertford. And because of health, Frances couldn't travel. So she says all these lovely things like, I travel on the wings of the imagination with you. And she reads all these travel accounts and she imagines herself with her friend. But one of my favourite episodes from the letters is in 1739. Henrietta goes to visit in Italy, in Bologna, a woman called Laura Bassi. Now, Laura Bassi was the first woman in Western history to hold a professorship. She's only the second woman ever recorded to gain a PhD, and this was in the sciences. So Henrietta goes to her house where Laura Bassi runs a school, and she kind of lectures and is this really well-respected intellectual. And she writes this like wonderful piece about how she was such a like interesting intellectual woman, that she was really incredible, and she came away feeling really kind of amazed by her. And then she tells Frances about this, and Frances writes back that Laura Bassi's achievements do honour women because she's so intellectual and she's so brilliant. And I just love this idea of them kind of making this pilgrimage almost to this female professor's house in Italy. It's quite a contrast with the previous scandal, but I just think it's such a lovely story.
Yeah, and I love that idea that you mentioned earlier as well, that idea about the Grand Tour being about not just seeing sights, but going and meeting people and people being an attraction as well.
Yes, very, very, very much so.
So when did the Grand Tour go out of fashion and why? It strikes me that I'd love to do it today.
Me too. That makes two of us. So some people say it comes to an end with the kind of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and that's probably the end of the traditional Grand Tour where you go to France or Switzerland and then Italy. But then it does expand out, but it kind of becomes overtaken with the development of railway and steamship travel, the expansion of the British Empire out into India. People are traveling further and further afield. Europe isn't quite as exciting anymore, but it's also more accessible. So it kind of sort of comes to a natural end because of that. But also, part of the reason people were so obsessed with going to Italy in particular was they saw this kind of kinship to the ancient age of Rome, back to this Roman Empire idea again. And during the 19th century, that really declines. They don't look backwards to Rome quite so much. So it doesn't seem so essential to go there and kind of see all these ancient ruins and kind of understand it as kind of a parallel age to the age they were living through. They see it as kind of, there's more to the world. Like, we can go out and, we're kind of conquering all these countries. We need to go see these. So it kind of expands out and kind of loosens its concept a little bit. So this idea of going to Europe, people still did it, like plenty of people, but it wasn't seen as kind of this phenomenon in the same way that it had been seen before.
And finally, why do you think that this is historically significant? Is it more than just some toffs going on a gap year? Can it tell us something about the spirit of the age?
I think it really can tell us something about the spirit of the age. And I think it is very easy to look at it and see it as some toffs going on a gap year. And actually, in a lot of cases, it was. But it really is this age, particularly the 18th century and kind of the years bookending the 18th century, is this period of enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is kind of hard to define as an intellectual kind of movement. It's the successor to the Renaissance, and it's kind of a movement in thought where people are literally being enlightened with new knowledge, literally casting light upon new knowledge. And they really believed that they had to test facts. They had to go out and see things for themselves. They had to scientifically write about things, kind of test methodologies, all these ideas. And part of that was going and seeing these things for yourself and trying to understand your place in the history of the world. Trying to understand like what had come before you and being able to physically touch it and kind of interact with it and understand where you were in relation to that. If we look at the Grand Tour and think of it as kind of this idea of curiosity, of enlightenment, that kind of really is ingrained in the spirit of the age, to go travel and see these things for yourself and kind of literally be an eyewitness to the past and other people and kind of make your own decisions and be informed by your own opinions. So, and I feel like I've kind of put this really kind of higher level on it, because there were some people who really just did want freedom and they really wanted to travel around and they just wanted to enjoy what Europe had to offer. But for a lot of people, it really was about going and seeing these things themselves and really understanding them and not taking for granted what was written in books, being able to kind of have their own ideas about the world around them.